Okay, so the last couple classes, we were talking about that transition from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance, like those 13th century, 14th century, those periods when things were beginning to change. And we saw at least 200 years before the official Renaissance that they were already looking to classical or sort of Greco-Roman styles, and that it was okay for the first time in a long time, something that had been taboo throughout most of the Middle Ages. And I had mentioned Petrarch and the importance of his writings, but as I said, I'd talk about him a little bit later. So I do want to talk about his contributions because he really is the voice of change. He's writing in the 14th century. The Renaissance officially begins in the 15th. It's really about 1400 that we identify as a date. Now, of course, take it for what it is. Things don't begin on a day, but that's sort of, we have to have some sort of break. It confuses students if you don't pigeonhole something neatly for them. So that's what we do. That's why you take advanced classes, because that's when they unteach all the stuff they taught you in the introductory class. It's true. It's mostly a matter of going, how we said this? Well, that isn't quite accurate. We had to do that, so you unlearn all those things you learned the first time around. So he's writing, and he's the one who actually names the Renaissance. He's the first one to use that term, that his own age is a period of rebirth. Because of course that's what Renaissance means, Renaissance, rebirth. He gave it that name, and he's the one who began interpreting the Middle Ages as a period of decline. He's the one that called it the Dark Ages, and by that he meant everything before them, going back to anything between the Roman Empire and them was the Dark Ages in his mind, because he saw it, very, very negatively. He's one of the first to openly suggest that we should study the ancients. Let's study Greece and Rome. Let's stop thinking of them as merely, the pagan world, but we've got things to learn from them. And what he did that was so important was he linked the classical world. I'm going to use that term now to refer generally to Greco-Roman world. I'm just calling classical. And he linked that to Christianity, because that had been the problem. It was in the Middle Ages, it was the other. It was the opposite of the Christian world. He's going to link them. And when he does that, and we're going to see that clearly in the art and everything else, when he does that, it's like an instantaneous sort of approval. Now it's okay. Now we can see, it's almost the same way, they dealt with the relationship between the New Testament and the Old Testament, how they kind of reinterpreted the Old Testament through the eyes of the New Testament and saw it as a foreshadowing of the future. Well, that's what they're going to do with the Greco-Roman world. It's a foreshadowing of the Christian era to come. And the minute you do that, it's just a justification, but it's a way of making something that was taboo now okay. So I have the quote from him there. It's also true that there was a huge economic boom around 1400, and that's going to have a lot to do with it as well, particularly in Italy, because we know that's where it begins. Remember those plagues of Black Death, the worst. 1348 was the single worst year in Europe, particularly in Italy. About 25% of the population died off within a very short period of time from the plague, from the Black Plague. And as horrible as that is, that kind of rapid decline in population combined with several really good years of crops meant a huge economic boom. There was suddenly resources aplenty for fewer people, and it meant people were getting rich. And art always is centered around people with money. And now we have people with that disposable cash. So all that is happening at this time. What we're looking at here is a map of what I'm going to refer to as Italy, but of course it was not Italy at the time. There was no such thing as Italy until the modern era. There were a bunch of separate independent republics and duchies and the like, but we use the term Italy referring to this group of nations running through the center, not the kingdom of Naples. Naples, southern Italy has its own history. It's a world unto itself. For much of history, it's still independent at this time, but it isn't long after that. It becomes part of Spain. All of southern Italy is Spanish territory, well up into the 18th century. You study Southern Italian art when you're studying Spanish art, and we're not even going to go there. And also, Venice, the Republic of Venice, which was a huge republic at that time, that has its own stylistic history. So we are going to look at Venetian, but we're going to look at it separately. We'll look at Italian art, and then we'll look at Venetian art as if they're sort of two separate things, because they really are. So all of these different nations, Duchy of Milan is very important, Siena, Florence, these are the wealthiest. And the wealth is centered around families, important families. In Milan, you've got the Sforza family, the Visconti family. They are major patrons of the arts. They're major supporters of this new style, this new rebirth. In Florence, you have the Medici, and we're certainly going to see things that they have supported. You get the Montefeltros in Urbino, they're major commissioners. So art is tied to these families. They're the ones that are hiring artists. Because remember, I said last time, Italian artists, even in the 14th century, were not as limited by the guilds. They were free to take commissions on their own. And this is who they're taking commissions from, these wealthy families. So you've got more people with money wanting art. You've got artists who are now free to work for those people. You've got this sort of perfect storm that's going to be supporting this new way of thinking. And this is one of many different reasons why the Renaissance is born at this time. We're mostly going to be looking at Florence and artists working in Florence, because the Medici, not entirely, but the Medici early on were really the first families in this area to support the arts and sponsor the arts. They were responsible for the Neoplatonic Academy in Florence, which is a school dedicated to teaching ancient philosophies. Plato or Neoplatonism is what they taught. So these ideas are being supported by them, as well as the art that reflects it. I just want to look at briefly at one of the earliest structures from this period and see how these Renaissance churches are so different from Gothic, the great Gothic cathedrals, because they reflect a very different spirituality. It's not just sort of art that's changing, but it's a whole cultural system that's changing, and religion is changing as well. We've already talked a bit about it when we looked at some of that Netherlandish art, some of that Flemish art, and we saw, remember that Annunciation scene that was set in a kitchen, like an ordinary home, and that I mentioned that the church was calling for art that people could understand. They wanted things that were clearer, more understandable, more down to earth, less ephemeral and otherworldly, like the medieval art. And the churches are going to reflect that. The Gothic cathedral is a perfect example of medieval art. It's big, it's dark, it's ephemeral, it's hard to even see in it or understand it. It's mystery, and that's what medieval spiritual world was, mystery. That's supposed to understand it, etc. But the Renaissance is about clarity, and it's about understanding, and the church wanted changes. So the church is going to reflect that. We're just briefly going to look at San Lorenzo, which is considered the first church designed by Brunelleschi, and it's laid out on, again, a very recognizable plan. It's not a different plan. The plan is not that different from the very first Christian church we saw, old St. Peter's in Rome. There's the nave and the transept, etc. The parts are the same, but there are some differences. This building has a mathematical regularity that Gothic cathedrals didn't. Gothic cathedrals were largely organic. You started at one end and you built it, and then you built a little more and a little more, and every window is slightly different. Every space is a little. They weren't mathematicians, they were stonemasons. They were master stonemasons. But now we've got, really for the first time, architects. This is the first time since antiquity that we can use the word architect. You've got an intellectual who is designing a building and turns it over to craftspeople who are specialists and know how to build it. which is sort of the world we live in today, but it's not the world of the Middle Ages. It is now the world of the Renaissance. And so he's mathematically created this design based on modules, repeated modules of space, mathematically calculated, particularly based on the square, the perfect square. You know, perfect geometric forms are important. You never saw perfect forms in the Middle Ages. Forms were elongated, or these tall forms, but everything is now related to everything else. One thing that is new, we didn't have before, that really is a good example of how society has changed, is something new in the church, is all these chapels on the side. Gothic cathedrals, Romanesque, nothing we saw before have these. You enter them from the side aisle, and they're just called side chapels. And these are really owned by or sponsored by wealthy families. Like each wealthy family would have their own private side chapel. And we will, not today, but we will be looking at the art in one of those. They're responsible for the art or whatever, they pay for it. And below that is the family crypt. So these side chapels are different. They reflect the power of these families, these wealthy families who are putting money into the building itself and have a special relationship with that building. I just find it an interesting comparison. Remember back in Greek art, we were talking about symmetria, or this almost obsession with proportion and ratio and this perfection of the human form. Idealism is the language of antiquity, and it will now again be the language of the Renaissance. And in the same way that the human body was calculated based on really an algorithm, although they didn't know that word at the time. Interestingly, it is a Greek word. The word algorithm is a Greek word. It's just a formula for perfection, that every part has a ratio to every other part, and you can determine the perfect human form if you know one measurement. Like if you know the measurement from here to here, then you can fit that measurement into this complicated algorithm and calculate every other part of the human body and have perfection. They didn't care that no one person really had that, because they understood that. That was the whole point. We're flawed, we don't want to depict you. We want the ideal person. So the building is the same way. Once you determine the dimensions of that square, from that, you can calculate the width of the nave, the length of the aisle. Everything is calculated mathematically from one portion. And that's a way of thinking that elevates intellectualism and rationalism, which is very antithesis to the sort of rejection of those ideas in the Middle Ages. Here's the interior, and right away there are some really obvious differences. It is a big building. I think the scale is really deceptive. It doesn't look big until you notice the little benches down here, and you realize it's bigger than I thought, because it has a rationalism to it, and it's a return to Roman architectural design, mostly, but not completely. It's a mixture of Greco-Roman design. Roman columns, Roman capitals, Roman half-circle arches, which we haven't seen for a long time, coffering in the ceiling, but no vaulting. So it's not Roman vaulting, flat ceiling, but the designs are Roman. It's designed to be clear and readable. And in fact, the relationship between the Renaissance interior and the Gothic cathedral interior is a perfect metaphor for religion in those two periods of time. You weren't supposed to understand. You were supposed to enter a Gothic cathedral and feel dwarfed, feel unimportant, feel minimal. But the Renaissance is a beginning of humanism. The whole world centers on the human being. You're not dwarfed, and everything is understandable. You just have to know how to understand it. So these are models. I like to talk about models. Every era and age creates models that, if you know how to understand them, are a reflection of how they see the world. You can look at any point in time, and if you know how to, what forms to look for or what patterns to look for, then you can see how people think. And these are both beautiful examples of how people thought at different moments in time and how they relate to their environment and what they believe is their relationship to that environment, how they believe the world works and how they fit into that world. That's what you see in both of these structures. So we're not going to look at any more architecture because we could spend years just doing that. Early Renaissance. When I refer to early Renaissance, I'm basically talking about the 15th century. We call that early Renaissance. And another work that's associated with Florence is this version by Donatello of David. We're going to look at 3 different versions of David in before this class is over, and I'll bring the others back and we'll compare them because there are 3 different moments in time and they're perfect examples of 3 different moments in time. Now, this is the earliest. It's also the first life-size nude sculpture since Antiquity. There's no life-size sculpture in the Middle Ages. Certainly, they're not going to show a nude figure in the Middle Ages, perhaps other than Adam, and that wouldn't have been in sculpture. So that also is harking back to the classical world where, the nude figure is the heroic ideal. What do we have? The return of the heroic ideal, that classical sense of nudity as symbolizing the heroic. They've really lost by this time any memory of why that is. In the Greek world, we know it was because athletic competitions were practiced in the nude and athletes were their great heroes. And so that's why they depicted nude figures to symbolize heroism. But they've forgotten all that, half of that by the Renaissance. All they know now is, well, that's heroism. They don't remember why. I mean, that connection to the athletic competitions is gone. Its meaning is now totally independent. This figure, we don't know a lot about this figure. It's sort of mysterious in terms of who commissioned it, but it was commissioned to symbolize the city of Florence. And in fact, all 3 of the pieces we're going to look at were made to symbolize Florence. David, this is the biblical King David. It's David fighting Goliath. That's the theme. Florence identified with David. And there's an inscription on the original base to this piece that explained that Florence had just defeated the Duchy of Milan to the north in a war. And Florence was the underdog, right? Milan had a huge military and they were supposed to win, but Florence won. And because of that, they formed this identity with David, this biblical David, who was the underdog and defeated Goliath. So that's their logic for, we're like David. And one of the other reasons why they like to embrace David is that, and why in fact here he's depicted in a particular way. Here he's depicted as very youthful, which is, I think, fairly true to the biblical story. He was young. He's depicted here as very youthful, not an older, big, muscular person. Later ones will show him that way. But this one, he's very young, because the weaker you show him, the more powerful it is that he defeated a giant. I mean, if you show him, as Arnold Schwarzenegger, and then he defeats a giant, it's less impressive, right? So they're really kind of emphasizing his weakness. And it also says, you're the master of your fate. That's a very Renaissance ideal too. Part of what Petrarch was saying is, in a humanist world, you take control of your fate. You're not nothing in this world. You have power, take control, go out, interact with the world. And that's very much what this story is saying. You are the master of your fate. It's not fated. There's not some unknowable spiritual thing that's controlling everything. And this is now okay. Now, for some of you have heard me talk about narrative. This is a good time to talk about it. Telling stories, because that's one of the issues you have to deal with in the visual arts, is how to tell a story. It's easy to write a play or write a novel and tell a story. It's much harder to make a sculpture and tell a story, because sculptures don't have moments in time. You know, in a sculpture, you've got to choose one moment. You got to pick a moment, and you're locked into it. So how do you pick a moment? Well, you have three choices. If it's a story where there's something happens, some adventure thing happens, you can either show the moment before it happens, you can show right in the middle of the action, or you can show after the action. Those are your three choices. And each of the three Davids we're going to look at choose a different moment. And it's, again, a perfect reflection of that moment in time. This is a moment. When is this moment? Can you tell? It's Goliath's helmet. So it's after, it's clearly after, which is why he's so relaxed and so calm, you know. So there's no emotion here. There's no like, oh my God, what's going to happen? Like there would be if it was before it happened, which would create a really dynamic and emotional scene. Or if you were right in the middle of it, that would be very emotional, but not this. And this is very Renaissance. Renaissance art, like Greek art, now they're looking back to Greek. Remember, Greek art was totally dispassionate until you got to the end, till the Hellenistic. But classical Greek art, you didn't see emotion. It was totally reserved. That's what you're going to see in the Renaissance. He's totally relaxed. So they're never going to pick the moment of drama in a Renaissance work of art. It's always going to be the moment of some moment that's immediately calm. So I think I've got a detail here of his face. It's an interesting, people always want to know about that hat. I think it's just a shepherd's hat. I think it's the sort of thing that was associated with shepherds at the time. I think that's what they intended it to mean. You know, there's a little sort of, it's bronze again, and remember, sort of bronze was very much the material of the Greek world in particular, and somewhat the Roman. His eyes are somewhat stylized. I find these sort of interesting. They're not really realistic quite as much as possible, but nonetheless, Donatello's piece sets a pattern and that we're going to follow in other works, especially other works of David. Interesting comparing it to this period. He's undoubtedly looking at Greek works. This was that Praxiteles, Hermes with the baby Dionysus, late classical 4th century BC piece with that exaggerated S-curve, very sort of elegant. It's late classical. And that seems to be what he's looking at. It's very like that. The muscles are very soft. The proportions are somewhat elongated. And that seems to have been the model for what Donatello was looking at. Donatello is really sort of the creator of Renaissance sculpture. He's sort of the first person that sets this style that is Renaissance sculpture. And they're all searching for that because, I mean, you can say, okay, let's do classical revival, but what does that mean? You know, what does that mean? Does that mean we're going to use the materials? Does that mean it's not, we know now the choices they made, but at the time they had to go through a kind of period of, you know, what does that mean? What should I copy? What should I not copy, etc. In terms of painting, our first real master is Masaccio. And Masaccio actually died very young. He was 24 when he painted this, and 2 years later he's dead. And he still is the most famous and was the most famous painter even in his lifetime. And we still remember him as certainly the founder of a Renaissance style. This is certainly one of his many known works. This is a fresco, and the majority of the paintings we're going to look at are frescoes. This is a great age. 15th century fresco painting is everywhere because these new churches that are smaller in scale, more light, you can now paint walls inside them and see them. You didn't see a lot of art inside a Gothic cathedral. It was too dark. You had the stained glass windows and that was about it. Now you can see inside. We're getting painted altar panels. We're getting frescoes on the walls. So that's another reason. So it's a version of the Trinity. It's a perfect example of early Renaissance style. Now, if you're embracing this new aesthetic, this new sensibility, of humanism, and you're listening to the Franciscans who are telling you to look at the world and go out in the world and experience things to understand the world, then that is leading them back to greater and greater naturalism, which is what we saw in the ancient world, not the spiritual distortion and stylization of the Middle Ages, but more, accuracy, what things look like. But it will be an idealized naturalism, just like in the Greek world, at least. So if you want naturalism and you're trying to paint something like this, you have a problem. There's another problem we have in the visual arts, and that is translating form. Particularly if you're a painter. If you're a sculptor, you don't have those problems. A sculpture is taking a three-dimensional subject. Let's say when Donatello looked at a human form, that's a three-dimensional thing, but he's working in a three-dimensional medium. He's not having to translate anything. He's making a three-dimensional thing of a three-dimensional thing, a three-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional form. But if you're a painter, you're not doing that. You're translating one language, the three-dimensional language of the world, but you have to figure out how to translate that onto a two-dimensional surface. That's a whole other issue from what a sculptor does. It's a translation. And now if you're trying to be accurate and create something believable, you have to find a way to do that. And that's where we get, and we'll come back to this in a moment. Well, some terms. We're going to look at the main painting up above, and then we have below the predella. And remember, the predella is that below an altarpiece, that horizontal band. It's still called a predella even when you don't have an altarpiece, and it's a fresco. So we're also going to look at the predella. But this is all painted, all illusionistically painted. So two things to create the illusion of real three-dimensional depth. You need one thing is you need an object that truly looks three-dimensional. And one way you create that is by using chiaroscuro. And chiaroscuro is an Italian word that literally translates light and dark. And it just means modeling the form. Shadow, highlight. That gives you what looks like a three-dimensional form. But that's not enough alone. You also have to find a way to carve out a space for that three-dimensional form to exist in order to believe it. So now, that was the easy part. Now, how do I get a realistic three-dimensional space, depth behind the picture plane? Remember, the picture plane is this imaginary surface. The Renaissance liked to think of paintings as windows, as if you were looking through a window into a room or into a space. That's how they thought about it. And in that context, this glass of the window, this imaginary glass, is what we call the picture plane, this invisible plane that you're looking through. How do you do that accurately? We've seen them in earlier works sort of intuitively experimenting with it. They understand certain things. We all know intuitively certain things. We know how to read that something's farther away. If something's smaller, it must be farther away than the bigger things, right? That's how our brain interprets the world. If something's higher up, it's farther away. You may not realize you do that, but as I look at the world, the lower they are on my picture plane, the closer they are to me. And as I go up, they get farther away. The third way we read distance or space is by overlap. You are overlapping people behind you, so I know you're closer to me. And when you put the three together, that's how your brain sees three dimensions. Of course, it also, because we have two eyes, we also triangulate, and that comes into it as well. So how do you do that scientifically? Well, someone came up with a way. His name was Brunelleschi, and he was actually the architect of the church we just looked at a moment ago. He's the first one to come up with and sort of codify linear perspective, or one-point linear perspective. What he's doing here, and this is how he did it, this is where he came up with it, he's holding this is a mirror, which is reflecting a building over here. That's the Pisa Baptistry, is what he actually used. And he made a hole right in the middle of that mirror that he's looking through. So he's holding a mirror facing away from him, and he's peeking through a hole right in the middle of it. And then he's holding up like a piece of paper there. And then as he looks at it, he's drawing the lines scientifically. We'll look at how I'm sure you are all familiar with one point perspective. This is the simplest kind. All you need is a horizon line. You decide where your horizon line is, you make a vanishing point, and then every line that is meant to be perpendicular to the picture plane is drawn at an angle. Those lines are called the orthogonals, and they meet at the vanishing point. That gives you like a grid to draw everything into, to create scientifically accurate proportions. You don't have to just guess that it's at an angle or how small it's going to be. In this case, our vanishing point is right here. That's eye level. And so this is look, we have a barrel vault, a Roman, this is all Roman architecture here that he's painted. And the lines between the coffers in the barrel vault, if you extend them, they all meet right here, which creates that illusion. This is what you can do. You can get really complex. You can have multiple vanishing points, because what if everything isn't lined up? You know, what if there's a box or something or a table and it's at an angle? Well, then you need another vanishing point. You can have multiple vanishing points. It gets complicated. But once you know how to do it, it's very simple. Just lay out your lines and have something incredibly believable. Here, for example, these column bases diminish correctly because this line marks the top of the columns. And so it tells you how tall to make them, and then it becomes an illusion. In this case, these cylinders are technically all the same size, but which why that one looks bigger because it's an illusion. If they had lined them all up to the same height, then you would have the perspective illusion. So now, what about the depth into space? Here's how it's calculated. Here's the viewer and your point of view. This would be your eye level. It's literally right at eye level. If you're standing in front of this, this is what you see. So here's the actual piece. So here's your eye line. And so your vanishing point is right there. This is the horizon line. And then everything above the horizon line, you're looking up at, and everything below it, you're looking down at. And when you draw the lines in, you don't have to sort of guess where to put them. This is so accurate that people have calculated exactly the size and space and depth of this niche. You know, you can actually calculate it out three-dimensionally. It's that accurate. Now let's look at what's depicted, because it's also just as rational as the laying out of space. It's called the Trinity, and we have the Trinity is right here. We have, this is God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit is a white dove right here. So all in line, perfectly symmetrically, is the Trinity right in the middle. Symmetry is going to dominate Renaissance art, just as it dominated Greek art. It's stable, it's calm, it's intellectual, it's non-dramatic, so that will dominate. But he's giving us other forms. This is the Virgin Mary who's looking out at us and gesturing. That is that's what we call a sacra conversación, or sacred conversation. When you have a holy person in a picture, and it's not always Mary, it could be a saint, and they're looking out at you and they're gesturing. What they're doing is they're inviting you. It's meant to invite you in. So it's called you're having a sacred conversation with that person. So that's not a new idea, and we see it in art in other places. Across from her is young John the Evangelist. Who are these two? Patrons. They are the two people who paid for this and get themselves painted into the scene like we saw last time, only they're not actually in the scene, they're on a ledge outside the scene. It's just like the people who were outside the door last time. So does that mean we should interpret this as a vision? In the same way it was suggested that we were supposed to interpret that the Merode altarpiece as a vision, where the donors are opening the door and looking in, and maybe they're having a vision. That is another question, is maybe we're supposed to, we don't know, maybe we're supposed to think that way. But let's look at how he's using form to construct the piece, to compose the piece. We'll look at what we call the composition. The composition is how it's composed. So that would include things like symmetry, the balance of two figures, everything is balanced, but he also uses color. So we get red here. I don't remember the guy's name, but wearing the red robe identifies him as a city official in Florence. It's sort of an official regalia he's wearing. But we also see St. John wearing red, and one side of Christ's garment is red. And by doing that, he's bringing your eye in here and drawing it up that way. On the other side, we get his wife who's wearing blue, and the Virgin Mary is wearing blue. And then this side of Christ is blue, which pulls your eye in here and brings it in this way. And when the two come together, they cross in the middle and create this perfect, again, balance, this perfect intellectual placement of the forms that draw your eye up to Christ. Now, let me back it up for a second so we can see it without, sorry, I should have put it in again. There seems to be a sort of hovering ledge here that God is standing on. It's hard to read exactly what's going on in space, but he seems to be standing on this ledge that's sort of hovering in space. So that's how we are meant to read it. So that was a fresco. It's in a very good shape. And the one thing I hadn't talked about yet is the predella. Now this is painted in grisaille. And remember, painting in grisaille means you're painting in black and white to create the illusion of a three-dimensional sculptural form. And so it's painted as if there were real columns and a sarcophagus and a skeleton on top of it, and written in Latin above that sarcophagus, it says, roughly translated, what you are now, I once was, and what I am now, you will one day be. Now, it's a memento mori in the sense that it's a reminder of death, but it's also what we call a vanitas reference. And we'll talk more later about vanitas because that's real big in a couple hundred years from now. But it's reminding you, don't be vain. This is something the Greeks always thought about too. This seems to be deeply rooted in the classical ideal. If you're driven by that sense of everything has to be presented as ideal and perfect, it's real easy to get caught up in that and think and have what the Greeks called hubris, which is excessive pride or thinking too highly of yourselves. And the Greeks were very aware of that, and we're always warning you about hubris. It's in the Renaissance and the next couple hundred years, it has more to do with vanity. It's like, okay, you're rich now and you're doing well and you're young and you're healthy, but this is not what matters. This is temporary. This is somewhat of a Christian message as well, that, don't get too caught up. Yeah, we're back in the physical world now, and we care about owning all these things, and we care about having these things, but don't forget, in the end, that's not what really matters. That's not permanent, and we're all going to die. So these are important little reminders. Because of this new freedom, because they're not ruled by a guild or told how to work, we actually get a lot of different styles in the Renaissance. People work in different ways. They don't all have to do the same thing anymore. There's no rule book as to how you show things. So we do get different styles. Some lean more toward medievalism still. Some are totally mathematical, cold, calculated, very much like the Masaccio was. But Fra Angelico's work is a unique style, and I think he's worth looking at least briefly. Fra Angelico, which literally translates as angelic brother, was a Dominican monk, and he was also a painter. And he was a painter before he took monastic orders. He painted while he continued working while he was a monk. He didn't take private commissions. He's not out there, making money being an artist, but he is doing all of the paintings for the Dominican monasteries, and there are lots of them, so they're keeping him busy. So he's a very well-known painter. I must say that in 1984, Fra Angelico, pardon me, no, it's Angelico, was beatified by the Catholic Church, which is the first step towards sainthood. So and I don't really know much about the background of why that was, but we may someday have a Saint Angelico after this painter. This also a fresco was painted for his monastery. And it's related to what are called the 9 ways of prayer. In the Dominican order, they have 9 hours, so 9 times during a day or a 24-hour period when they stop and do certain prayers. And this particular scene was painted at the top of a staircase that led to their private cells. And so in the monastery, every time you passed one of these paintings, he had 9 paintings, each one associated with a specific prayer. And each time a monk passed them, they stopped and said that prayer. So, and this is connected to the Hail Mary. It's the Annunciation, which is related to the Hail Mary prayer. So every time they went up the staircase and saw that painting, they would stop and do a Hail Mary. So it's a functional painting. This wasn't commissioned for a church. It's a very private in an area that only the monks would see. So it's very special. You know, he's not as obsessed with this classical accuracy. I mean, when you look at Mary, there's some what I call medievalisms in that, you know, she's elongated, the proportions aren't really right. She doesn't really look 3-dimensional, but that's not what this is about. This is really spiritually driven, more so than most Renaissance art. And that's what's important to him. We do get this wonderful porticos, the again, Roman arcade. A lot of this excessive detail, which is usually not something you see in Renaissance art. If you've noticed already, we haven't seen all the little details. There's no chalice, there's no white lilies, there's no, you know, traditional details that would be in an Annunciation from an earlier period where they're doing away with that sort of thing. But we do find a lot of detail out here and down here. And that suggests he's very influenced by tapestries, because if you've ever seen medieval tapestries or even Renaissance tapestries that have a lot of landscapes, they're very busy and it's filled with detail, but he's doing a lot of sort of botanical accuracy in here that they didn't always worry about at the time. There's a little text down here. As you can see, what it says is, it says, as you revere this figure of the intact Virgin while passing before it, beware lest you omit to say a Hail Mary. So he's sort of telling you there to do that. So, and again, I was going to skip this just because so much stuff to cover, but I find it really hard to just skip anything. We have to look at something by Botticelli. And this painting is the Renaissance. If there's any one painting that says everything about the Renaissance, this is it. Botticelli's style was unique. It was a very personal style. He worked for the Medici a lot. This was painted for the Medici. It's titled Primavera, which means spring, translates as spring. Technically, it translates as first green, which means spring. So Primavera is spring. It's an allegory of spring. It's an allegory of love. It's an allegory of fertility. It's an allegory of the Renaissance as a whole, because that is, the Renaissance is about rebirth. It's about spring. It's about something new beginning. And it reflects the philosophies of the Neoplatonic Academy, and also the connection to classical myth, this linking of classicism and Christian symbolism. He's also influenced by tapestries, by the way. You can see that in here clearly. First of all, this was commissioned, painted for the wedding of Lorenzo de' Medici. So it's commissioned by the de' Medici that honors Lorenzo, and we know exactly when that happened. That was in 1482. First of all, we have Venus in the center, but Venus at this time was associated particularly with the Virgin Mary. Venus, Roman, they use the Roman terminology here because this is Italy after all, but she was seen as having 2 natures. One was the physical and the earthly, and that was really the Roman Venus, but they've also now linked her to the idea of her other side, which is the universal, the divine, and that's how they're seeing her, by equating her with the Virgin Mary. As bizarre as it may seem to equate this the Roman goddess Venus with the Virgin Mary, they find a way to do it by saying, well, she had this other side too, and that's the side we're looking at. So that is being linked here. There are orange trees in the background. Those are meant to symbolize the Garden of Hesperides, which is sort of from Greek mythology. But golden fruit like this is actually on the coat of arms of the Medici family. So it's linking them to the Medici, golden orbs. The winds, the zephyrs, this green guy on the right is the zephyr, the west wind. And Chloris is in front of him, and she's a virgin nymph, and you can see vines coming out of her mouth, and then Flora next to them. So this here, this is Flora. She is really spring, and as she's scattering things, things are growing. We have the three graces, which is an old motif that again goes back to Greco-Roman world. The three graces are three female figures that symbolize virtues, particularly chastity, beauty, and love. We have Cupid, a little Cupid up above, about ready to aim. Someone has identified, and I'm sure this was somebody's doctoral dissertation because nobody else would sit down and do this, but has identified 138 specific identifiable plants, all of which grow and bloom near Florence. So that's all in there somewhere. And then Mercury over here. Now Mercury with his caduceus, Hermes, the Greek god Hermes, who's the messenger god, also associated with doctors, and the Medici, their name, the Medici are physicians. That's what the word Medici means, like medical and medico, Medici. So that's associated with Hermes. Also, he is associated with the astronomical sign of under Mercury and Venus, which is what it was in February, which is the stars they were under in February of 1482 when Lorenzo was married. And that is why this painting symbolizes and links the Medici to everything Renaissance. I mean, everything in here means something. And those are a lot of medievalisms. You know, that's just Botticelli. That's his style. He's still tied to this detailed symbolism. Most artists aren't, but that's very much Botticelli. The figures are very flat. There's not really a sense of depth and space. He's not concerned with any of that. They're like little cutout paper dolls on a flat surface. All of that is very, very much like a tapestry. So, you know, very different style from Masaccio and others.
Now, who was that person over on the screen?
Right here, that's the wind.
No, the one below, the woman.
Her, that's Chloris. She's a nymph. She's a sort of forest nymph. She's just, you know, in mythology. Renaissance scholars know everything. I'm not a Renaissance scholar. There are, I mean, there are dictionaries. I've got a symbolism dictionary. You can look up everything. You just, you know, what does a 3-inch candle symbolize? What's a 6-inch candle symbolize? What if, is it blown out? If is it just lit? I mean, is it dripping? I mean, every one of those things has different meanings. And fortunately, there's a little dictionary thing. You can look them all up. So people, this is what Renaissance scholars do. That's Mercury. Or Hermes, whatever you want to call him. I think it's symbolic that he's reaching up for something too, but I can't remember what that means. I think we'll not worry about that.
Well, it's a heck of a long and interesting story.
Yeah, it is. That's why I didn't want to skip it. We do have a very, very nice piece that's from this right at the near the end of this period at the Nelson. This is one of those three that are in that room with the knight. It's a Bellini, the Giovanni Bellini. The Bellini family, there were like 3 brothers, and one of their sister was married to another artist, and it's an artistic family. It's a beautiful piece. Oil on wood. So oil is just making its way down to Italy. It had been around up there in Flanders in the north, but the Italians are just beginning to work with oil, but they're still working on wooden panels. So it's an early Italian piece. A very, very Renaissance in its simplicity, in its, you know, its oil, so you can get these beautiful colors. much more accurately proportioned child, although I think it's a little bit iffy, but still it's a lot better than those medieval ones we saw. We're not 100% sure, but people have suggested that that tower in the background, since they've not been able to link it to any real site at all in Italy, they've linked it to the 18th Psalm, which says, "The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer and my high tower." So they think it might relate to that passage. Nobody knows for sure. But obviously it's an updated version of a motif that goes, all the way back through the Middle Ages. And go in and look at it. It's a beautiful painting. It's in beautiful shape.
And they put it on oil from the.
Yeah, this is oil. They, I mean, the panels were prepared. They're not putting it on raw wood. It's going to be prepared with a nice slick layer. They pretty much prepared them the same way they prepared tempera. They're still making panels the same way they made panels for icons, which would have been painted in tempera. They haven't yet kind of made the shift over to think about, well, this is oil, it's not tempera. Maybe we can paint on things differently. So it's still very much the tempera technique, tempera panels, just using oil instead.
You don't have a chance to know what kind of wood they prefer.
No, I don't. I'm sure Renaissance scholars know. Yeah.
When was that transferred?
It would have been in the very modern era. They haven't known how to do that for all that long. So my guess would be 20th century.
Okay.
They know how to do that now. You can, because it's oil, you can there's I've read about it, but I can't remember, that you can like lay it down, attach it to something, and then remove the back and then attach it to a canvas. Because the oil, will just form one solid piece. So let's take our first look at the Sistine Chapel. We're not looking at the ceiling, that's a little later. We're coming back to that later. I want to look at one of these paintings along the side walls, which are from this earlier period. I want to look at this one right here, but I want you to get a sense of the scale, because if I didn't give you something to look at, you wouldn't realize how big this thing really is. This is 12 foot by 19 foot. And here's a workman up here who's doing some cleaning, so you get a sense of the figure and the scale of those things. I think the Sistine Chapel scale is just so deceptive in photos. It just looks tiny in photographs, and it's absolutely not. So we're going to look at this particular painting, because this, to me, is the culmination of the early Renaissance. This is everything we've learned about Renaissance art we're going to put in this painting. And it sums it all up. It's all right here. And it has all of the problems of the early Renaissance as well. Perugino's delivery the keys to St. Peter. First of all, I want to point out that it is in the Sistine Chapel, which is in the Vatican in Rome. We're not looking at Florence anymore. We're looking at Rome, because by the late 15th century, the power of the popes is rising, and they're commissioning art and they're drawing artists to Rome. So we're getting a different kind of subject. It's not just about these merchant princes in these, northern Italian areas. The church itself, in the hands of these new powerful popes, are major patrons of the arts. And that really is very much what this is about. Obviously, we have Christ, as the title suggests, handing keys to St. Peter. Now, everybody knows St. Peter is the foundation of the church, right? He's the rock of the church. That's his name. Petra, Peter, means rock, literally in Greek. He's the foundation of the church. Christ entrusted him with the church on earth. St. Peter is considered to be the first pope, and all popes claim their power through Peter. So when you have a scene like this that shows Christ handing keys to St. Peter, this is a powerful political message at this moment in time. This is the Pope saying, I'm in charge. He handed it to me. He handed it to us. This is a statement of the power of the popes, just in the choice of the subject itself. It is a fresco still, but I want to look at how it's constructed and what's going on. Well, first of all, we see This is the most important part. We see two keys, a gold key and a silver key. I know it looks dark, but it's gold and silver. And the passage in the Bible, and I'm trying to remember where it is. It's Matthew. I know I've got it written here somewhere. Yeah, Matthew 16:19, where Christ gives the keys to the kingdom of heaven to Peter. Now, the kingdom of heaven is an important phrase because he didn't say, I'm giving you the keys to heaven. He says, I'm giving you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. This is important to the popes because the kingdom of heaven meant heaven and earth. So it's not only heavenly power and control, it's earthly power and control that's being given to St. Peter and thus the popes. So that's an important passage as well. So that's why there are two keys. They always want to know, was there a back door or something? Why does he need two keys to heaven? He doesn't. One, the gold one is heaven. The silver one is the keys, symbolically the keys to earth. So how is it constructed? Where is this place? This is a totally invented, made up, ideal place. And he's basing this on a lot of writings by architects that speak of the ideal architectural form. There are, Alberti is writing, one of the most important Renaissance architects, and he's talking about the perfect architectural form is a centralized building, either an octagon or a circle. A circle is like the perfect form. I mean, these are mathematically driven people, they're thinking in terms of mathematics. So he's invented this. There's no actual building that looks like this. And of course, these are recognizable, right? Those are what? Roman triumphal arches, right? They're Roman triumphal arches with this perfect ideal form. There's other symbolism in here. Once again, we get trees put together that don't grow together. Remember we encountered that in a Flemish piece earlier. He's using 1 point linear perspective. He's going to, chisel out space. He's using 1 point linear perspective, but he's also using aerial perspective. An aerial perspective is simply a recognition of the fact that as forms go back in far distance, you lose detail, you lose color, they kind of gray out and become lighter in color. So you see, these hills are lighter than these hills, which are lighter than these hills. So atmospheric perspective is called that because it comes from looking through atmosphere. Like you've ever driven across flat country and you look way out and see hills in the distance, you're actually looking horizontally through a lot of atmosphere and it distorts what you see. It changes the color. So we call it atmospheric perspective. And he's doing that in here as well. Now, 1 point linear perspective. Okay, where's the vanishing point? It's actually right back here. Now, the problem with that, it's problematic. And I think, this whole painting is very problematic. Your eye is drawn to the vanishing point, right? Because you've got all the orthogonals, which he lays out very nicely on this plaza that has all these nice lines on it, drawing your eye back. The problem is there's nothing going on there. That's not where you should be looking. That's not the important part of the scene. You should be looking down here. I mean, this is where it's happening, but he's drawing your attention away from it to this spot. This is very typical of early Renaissance art. It's like, it's about technique. And sometimes the technique takes over from, telling a good story, making the message. You're demonstrating your technique. Remember, these artists wanted to be famous. They wanted to show you what they could do. And that clearly took precedent here. And we're going to see others dealing with it. So he gives us this sharp foreground. Look at all the people. I mean, I think it's a very awkward, let me go back to the full thing. It's a very awkward painting in so many ways. Okay, this event is happening here and there's people around them. Why are they queuing up behind them in this flat, this line parallel to the picture plane? If you were in a big plaza and something was happening, people would be standing all around you, right? That's natural. They wouldn't like get behind. It's awkward, it's just not natural. And so we get a foreground, then we jump to a middle ground. Now there's another group of people all on one plane, and then we jump to a background on one plane. So the space is, to me, uncomfortable and unnatural, because it just takes these leaps. And this is the biggest difference you're going to see between early Renaissance and high Renaissance. It's not that they learn a lot to do more things. It's that they take the things they knew and they learn how to use them better, how to make them secondary to the story you're telling, not be the story that you're telling. And the one person that's going to do that immediately before anybody else does is a student of Perugino's, and who learned from Perugino but betters his master, and that is going to be Leonardo. Leonardo da Vinci is really the earliest high Renaissance master. He's working before 1500. We usually again think of 1500 or the 16th century. Now we begin the high Renaissance, but Leonardo is working in the 1480s, 1490s, and he's already taking things to another level. This is a perfect example of a Renaissance ideal. It's why the image is used, his drawing of the Vitruvian Man. Vitruvius was a Roman architect who wrote volumes on architecture, and sort of linked the human form. What Leonardo is doing, and if you're only going to use one part of his name, you always call him Leonardo. Don't ever call him Da Vinci. When I hear people do that, first of all, I cringe, but then it tells me they really don't know anything about art, because nobody who knows anything about art would call him Da Vinci. He's from Vinci. He's Leonardo from Vinci. You wouldn't call, you don't call him their name. It's not his name. There was no uniform naming system at this time. Some people had, what we're familiar with, like a family name, and then individual names, but a lot of other people were still just being named by where they were from. And at a certain point, did you say something? Sorry. Oh, anyway, at a certain point, people forget that that's what it meant, and then that becomes the family name. That's why we have a lot of family names that start with DE or DA or whatever. At one point, that was where they were from, but we've now forgotten that, and now it's just their name. So at this time, it wasn't really the family name yet. So Leonardo is his one and only name. What he's doing here is linking the ideal human form with the ideal perfect geometric form. It's like man is the center of all things. The perfection of the world is geometry, the perfect circle. Human body is a perfect ideal form. And this becomes a religious idea. What happens is mathematics and geometry in the world is something they begin seeking out now and looking for, because that becomes the sign of God's presence. Order in the world is a sign of God's presence. The whole conception today of a separation between science and religion is ludicrous. The Renaissance would have said, what the hell are you talking about? Renaissance science was all about religion. It was your religious duties to understand the science of a thing. And in mathematical precision, that was seen as the proof of God. Mathematical order and geometry were religious and spiritual. And you see it nowhere more clearly than in his famous Last Supper painting in Milan. The Duchy of Milan, in this case, sponsored by, paid for by the Sforza family, with the Sforza coat of arms up here. This is on the refectory wall. Refectory is a dining hall of a monastery that was supported by the family. I just wanted to show you the whole wall briefly, because they never really show it. They usually just focus on the main scene, but it is a whole wall up here. Also, you notice this is actually a doorway that was cut into and right through it in, I believe, the 17th century. I need to, who would be, 17th century, were brash enough to cut a hole right through the Last Supper. It's since been closed in, but once it's too late, it's gone. Fortunately, Leonardo had two students at the time who both did oil paintings at that time of this scene. And they're in great shape, because this is not in great shape. This is in terrible shape. It doesn't look anywhere near as good as you see. This is digitally enhanced. The reason this looks so bad, and well, let's go ahead and look at the whole thing. It looks much worse than this, is because, first of all, he was a great experimenter, and a lot of people experimented in the Renaissance. This is not a fresco. He's experimenting fresco. He's experimenting with using tempera and mixing the media. He was doing things that weren't a good idea. Sometimes experiments work and sometimes they don't. And this was not a good experiment. This was actually falling apart in his own lifetime. It was already disintegrating. And if he had just done true fresco, it would have been much better, but he didn't. It's also, been through hell. Napoleon's troops in the early 19th century used it to store ammunition. It was used at they used it as a stable and kept horses in there. They threw projectiles at the walls and everything else. It was bombed during World War II. There have been floods that damage the wall. So it's just had a really tough life. So it's digitally enhanced to see what we've got. What we have, first of all, is, we always start with the big picture. Students always want to know, writing about art, how do you talk about it? Where do you begin? I always suggest begin with the big picture and then look at the details. So let's look at the whole space. He's carved out this room for us, this sort of upper room where this possibly a Seder took place, because there are differences of opinion as to whether this was meant to be a Seder. Matthew, Mark, and Luke say it was a Seder dinner. John says no, the Seder was the day before the crucifixion, so whatever. Anyway, he's given us a space, and one of the brilliant things he's done here is the very, very minimal plain background. He doesn't draw your attention away from where you're meant to look. It's very plain. Let's take a look at a painting of it and get a little better sense of what it probably looked like or was meant to look like at the time. These, what now look like black squares, are actually tapestries hanging on the wall, and there was originally imagery on them that you could see. Here's what the gap would have looked like. You would have seen more trestles holding up the tables, his feet down here. And there are other details that we'll look at in a minute as well. The three windows in the back, there's no extreme symbolism here. What we do have, however, is subtle symbolism, things like three windows behind Christ for the Trinity, sort of backlighting him, little things like that that suggest it. Now, let's look at another detail. This is Judas, who's right here, and you really can't see him much at all in this painting, but this helps because you can see here he's holding the bag of silver. He's knocked over the salt cellar, which apparently is a bad thing to do, and he's reaching for the bread here, which you're not supposed to do because Christ hasn't broken the bread yet. So anyway, but you do see him better here. Now, when we look at how he's constructed, I find it really interesting that he's given us this long horizontal. Remember what we've talked about, and we'll talk more about, the meaning in horizontal forms versus vertical forms versus diagonal. Horizontal forms are the most stable, and this is a really exaggerated horizontal. The table just grounds it. There's no movement here. It's just this long frozen seat, this awkward seat. It's almost, he does it so well that you almost don't realize how awkward it is that everybody's on one side of the table. Why is everybody on one side of the table? Well, it's better for the design, but it doesn't look that weird to us because he's made it seem natural by the placement of the people. It also helps that there are, in the Last Supper, or at the Last Supper, there would have been 13 people, which is a perfect number. You put Christ in the middle, and then you've got 12, right? 6 and 6. We can divide the 6 into 4 groups of 3. And 4 and 3 is a sacred number in the church. It's a sacred number for a lot of people. 3 is, but 3 is the Trinity. So 3 is actually the symbol of the spiritual, and 4 is the symbol of the physical, because you've got the 4 elements. So when you're playing around with groups of 7, that's why 7 is also a sacred number. 12 is a sacred number. You can add them together, you can multiply them. Here, he's broken them down and using it as a spiritual reference. So you've got 3, 3, 3, and 3. So the sort of geometry of this and placement of the forms is seen as a religious message, a religious significance. In the order of this world, you see the presence of God, or the proof of God in this order. The orthogonals, which would be the lines lined up to the tops of the tapestries or the lines in the ceiling, if you extend all of them, they all reach the top of the head of Christ. Okay, so now they are leading you to the right place. They're leading you where they want you to look. And Christ himself is forming this triangle. This is, I mean, a perfect triangle. Not all triangles are like this, but this is a perfect equilateral triangle. And there's no more stable geometric form than an equilateral triangle. It can't be distorted. It can't be bent. It's what we call a stabilizing triangle. And I showed you when we were looking at Greek art, and we were looking at one of the metopes on the Parthenon, how it was constructed. The fighter was standing there with his legs apart, forming this stabilizing triangle. And we have it here. This is an invention that will, Leonardo will pass this on to other painters. We will see this used many times. So I'm so glad we're past that moment historically where I used to have to explain that this was not Mary Magdalene, because everybody had, during those years when everybody was reading the Da Vinci Code, it drove us crazy because everybody, no, we know that's Mary Magdalene. That's why the art world's confused. Number one, the art world has never been confused about who that is. That's young St. James. He's always shown that way. I'm so glad we can put that whole book behind us because it was a lot of trouble to have to explain that. Okay, let's compare these. Let's compare teacher and student. Some people think he designed this intentionally to kind of correct the errors or make a statement about, his teacher's work because this is done so much better. They're using the same techniques. There's not a technique here that isn't being used here in terms of perspective, linear perspective, aerial perspective, whatever, but he's grouping the forms different. He's drawing your attention to the right place. So it's an interesting, early Renaissance, high Renaissance. It's just another step has been taken that takes you outside of the awkwardness of earlier things. One more, Leonardo, that we should look at. And that is, his most famous portrait painting. It's a portrait of a woman named Lisa Giardini di Giocondo. She was the wife of a prominent merchant in Florence, commissioned portrait. The way this painting became so famous, I have real mixed feelings about this painting. Everybody does, I think, in the art world, because it's been elevated in sort of the common mind that this is the greatest painting ever made and it's on everyone's consciousness. That's a 20th century idea that came about in the early 20th century. It was stolen in 1911 and then returned in 1913, I think. Yeah, 1913. And there was like worldwide publicity, and that's when it became famous. All it takes is publicity. That's the same reason Munch's The Scream is famous, because it was stolen in the 1980s. Nobody heard of it before that. And then it came back in worldwide attention. And the only reason that was famous because it happened, I don't remember the date, could have been the 70s. It was during the Lillehammer Olympics in Norway. And like the whole world was looking at this one place, and that's when it was stolen. So that's why it got publicity. Anyway, at the same time, I don't want to say, oh no, forget about it, because it's a really wonderful portrait. And I love portraits. You're going to see more portraits because I like talking about portraits, because portraits are something that's very special in art, because it involves a kind of relationship between a sitter and the artist that's not there with other sorts of subjects, because people want to be seen in certain ways. He never was completed. He kept this most of his life. It was in his studio. It never, like, he didn't finish it and give it to her. He's known particularly for paintings like this. Now it's oil on wood. This is not a fresco, it's an easel painting. He's known particularly for sfumato. Sfumato literally just means smoke, but in art, it refers to the kind of hazy quality. You notice there's not a lot of sharp edges. It's just sort of this blur, this haze that softens the forms. And that's something he's very much associated with. This is also referred to sometimes as La Gioconda, and I'll often see people writing and calling it La Gioconda because that was her name, her name. So it's just called that. The Mona Lisa comes from My Lady Lisa, which simply Madonna Lisa means My Lady Lisa, and Mona is just short for Madonna. So Mona Lisa is just a short version of My Lady Lisa, which is where the name comes from. Okay, now having said that, one of the things that people talk about here, they talk about a lot of things, but one of them is her expression, right? The so-called enigmatic expression. I'm going to give you my point of view. I don't know if anybody else thinks this way. I don't care. But what I believe, you don't have to either. Why there's a difficulty in interpreting her expression is because of her lack of eyebrows. Right? This was common. This was common at the time. I've already talked about a long neck was seen as beautiful, and she does have an elongated neck. But so in the Renaissance, so was an elongated forehead. And women would often shave their hair way back to elongate this forehead. And they would also shave their eyebrows, which would also elongate. So you look at some Renaissance paintings and they're kind of weird looking, but that's what you may not be able to recognize why, but that's probably why. So I know now the problem with eyebrows is I don't remember where I learned this. There are more muscles in the eyebrows than any other part of your face in terms of movement. And eyebrows, when we read someone's expression, we aren't aware of it, but those eyebrows are the major thing. You know, when people talk about smiling with your eyes, or it looks like a fake smile, it's not the eyes, it's the eyebrows they're reading. Because if it's a fake smile, your eyebrows aren't doing the same thing they do when it's a real smile. So we get a lot of verbal cues from eyebrows, and without them, you can't read that smile. That's why her smile is enigmatic. She's also sort of looking to the side a little bit. They're usually looking in the direction they're seated. This is a new kind of portrait. It's what we call a half-length, three-quarter view. Well, first of all, portraits are new. There were portraits in the Middle Ages. Portraits began in the previous century, and a lot of them were full figure, but this is a motif that we're going to see repeated. Half-length, in other words, from the waist up, three-quarter view, turn to the side. And generally, they'll be looking in the direction they're turned. He's got her looking the opposite direction that she's turned, which makes her eyes look shifty, as well as the lack of eyebrows do that too. But so you're turning against, and that suggests without giving you, it suggests something, but doesn't give you anything. And I think that's why it's seen as interpreted that as being sort of enigmatic. So hands are important, faces are important. He's giving us this really interesting background, which he's also does in a lot of works. It's a real fantasy background. That's not Italy. Italy doesn't look like that. He's just made up this sort of really fanciful background, which is very much just his style more than anything else. But you can see the perspective. Again, this is a good example of aerial perspective going back in space. Here is a close-up, and you can see that sfumato, that delicacy of the lines, the edges that are so very, very soft. And you can also see, I think originally, you could probably see it better. There's a sheer sort of net veil that's over her, and you can see a bit of it here that's very, very soft and very delicate, and a bit of it there as well. This is that craquelure that I was talking about, those tiny little cracks. You're going to see that in most oil paintings. When they're bigger than that, and you see a lot of them, those are the ones that didn't dry properly. But here it's very soft and minimal, but it's just going to happen. It's the nature of oil, nature of oil paint. And then in the Nelson Gallery, this is the third of the three, Lorenzo Credi. And I brought this in because Credi was very influenced by Leonardo. This is the latest of the three. It's dated from 1510, and Leonardo's style is all over the place here. The group of three, which is something he's invented, I'll show you one of his in a minute, that fanciful background, the perspective here, the delicacy of the form. There's a lot of influence here of Leonardo. So we don't have a Leonardo, but we have a work that's influenced by, and it's pretty closely influenced by his Madonna of the Rocks, which I didn't really put on the list to talk about, but it's a grouping that he sort of creates himself, this sort of, I want to say triangle, but it's sort of very three-dimensional. It's almost more like a pyramid with an angel here, and Mary's hand over Christ. And again, the background is totally imaginary sort of grotto that they're in. This grouping of Christ, Mary, and this is the young John the Baptist. This is Christ and John the Baptist here. We know it's John the Baptist because he's holding a shepherd's crook. He's usually got like a scrap of fabric around here. There are ways, and you know, they're cousins anyway, and they're about the same age. John the Baptist is a little bit old, well, a few months older, because we saw that when we saw the Visitation sculpture, and an angel over here on the side. One of the big differences between High Renaissance and early Renaissance is early Renaissance was all about the rules and all about the mathematics and the technique. High Renaissance isn't as concerned, and in fact, they're not afraid to break the rules if it tells a better story. And we're going to see some artists do it more than others. Michelangelo does it all the time. He breaks rules all over the place. One of the rules that's being slightly tested here is light source. He's playing with light source in order to tell you a good story. It's to the left in most of the places, but not everywhere. We're getting light in places where it probably wouldn't be if it were strictly a spotlight from the left. I love this little passage here, which gives you, you know, a really good look at atmospheric perspective. And he's actually playing against that a little bit because of the intensity of that color blue. Because that's so intense, it tends to pull back up towards you a bit. See how it does that? It doesn't lay back like these do. These are very, very light. They'll go way, way back. But the intensity of this blue pops it forward. Because cool colors go back in space, warm colors come towards you. This is a blue color, but because of its intensity, it sort of pops. And these just wonderful rocks. I don't know where he got this idea. In this particular case, you see that child's relationship, which you see here as well. Christ is a baby, but he's not a baby. You know, he's giving you a blessing, like a priest would give you a blessing. And John recognizes his divinity and is praying to him. So yes, they're babies, but they recognize who they are. Now we're getting, particularly in Leonardo's, pretty accurate children, except they're really big. They're proportioned correctly, but their scale is a bit large. Over here, I think Credi has a few issues with necks, because that head doesn't really sit well on that body, and that head doesn't sit well on that body. He's having a problem getting that, you know, where the neck sort of goes. Yeah. Yeah, they're flip-flops too.
Oh.
Hmm?
For flip-flops.
Her flip-flops, right? Yeah, they had their flip-flops back then too. But also the looking at nature and the details of the accuracy of the plants, even in a fanciful landscape, he's going to give us, some accuracy of plants. Our second high Renaissance master is Michelangelo, and he is, without a doubt, I think most people today would recognize him as the most influential of them all, the most different of all of them, and we'll see why he is different. He is, his later work anyway, not this necessarily, but even to some extent this is looking forward to the future as opposed to looking back. And he's not afraid at all to break rules, and he breaks some rules here in this piece as well. You're seeing the real piece here, which is indoors, and then the reconstruction of it that's placed outside. It was originally going to be outside, but of course it got, I don't know when they decided this is too important a piece to be sitting outside and moved it in. But now you've got one outside, which is not the original. Of course, everybody's heard about how he thought about sculpture in terms of releasing the figure from the stone. He said that famously. He just, it was there when he got the block, quarried block, he just released it. He just removed everything that wasn't David. How did you do that? Well, just remove the pieces that weren't him. He was there before he even started. I'm very impressed with sculpture because there's a three-dimensional thinking there that I couldn't do. That's very different for me to think about, to doing that. What you have to know, this is quarried from marble, and it's quarried out of a specific block of marble that had been quarried about a little over 100 years earlier. It was called the Giant. I think they referred to it as this massive block of marble. And the first artist, the sculptor that tried to work with it about 100 years earlier, hit it a couple times and noticed that there's a vein going right through it, which is pretty much the end of a block of marble. That vein means that the next time you tap it, the whole thing could just crack right down the middle. That's very possible with marble, and it happened a lot, which nobody wanted to touch it. They just stuck it over on the side of the quarry. Nobody's going to work with this marble. It's just too risky. So he comes along 100 years later and I'll do it. What the heck? So he takes that block of marble and decides to work from it. Now, this one was commissioned by the Medici in Florence. So it's our second one, symbolizing the city of Florence. And it was so big because it was originally meant to be at the top of Florence Cathedral. It was not meant to be seen at ground level or even close. It was going to be way, way up high. So the scale reflects that, because this is not typical of Renaissance sculpture. They just didn't make things this size any more than the Greeks did, life size, but this is an exception because of where it was meant to be. It also explains the bizarre proportions, because you're kind of meant to be seeing it at the angle you see on the right. That's why I have that weird angle. He took into account the fact that you were going to be looking up at it, and he did a kind of reverse perspective on the proportions. The legs are way too short when you're looking straight on. Now, somebody has crawled up on a ladder here to look across it. You can see how short the legs are in relation to the torso, but that was intentional, because when you view it from this angle, they don't look short at all. They look quite long. So that's another, point that a point of departure in the way we think about this piece. That's one reason why they put it up on a tall pedestal, to approximate more that point of view. I wish some art historian would go out there and get down and take a good picture of the original, but everybody likes this view head on. I don't like the view head on because it's not how you were meant to see it. I want a nice view looking up of the original. So next time you go there, get me a nice photo, make a note of this view, because you're going to get there before I do, because I don't think I'm ever going to get there again. So here's our view. So setting aside the proportions of the legs. So as we talked about, carved from the giant. Now, remember, there are 3 moments in a story, right? Before the action, during the action, after the action. Donatello's was before the action. They wanted it calm, they wanted it intellectual. Michelangelo is giving us after the action. All Renaissance art will be either before or after. They will never embrace the height of the activity. That's not a Renaissance way of thinking. That's too emotional. It's not intellectual enough. However, the moment before, now Donatello's was after. I think I said it wrong a minute ago. Donatello's was after, so no jeopardy. This is before. So it's not as dynamic as in the middle of the action, but there is a little tension. I call it a controlled energy, and we'll look at a detail and you'll see that, because it's meant to be the moment where he's just looked to the side and just sort of spotted Goliath over there. They're not battling yet, but it's an intellectual view. It's also much, it's basically frontal. It is in the round, it's carved all the way around, but it was meant to be, you know, it's going to be up on the church. You weren't really going to see the back of it. So it's pretty much planar, meaning you see it all on one plane. You know, you could walk around it, but you're not going to learn anything more by doing it from the side or the back, other than you might see that sling sort of over his shoulder. And that's what that is. It's sort of the sling hanging down there. This was done just before, and I should have brought it back in and I didn't. Remember I said he was present when they excavated, when they found the Laocoon in Rome, that Roman sculpture of the priest with the snakes wrapped all around him and his sons, you know, very dramatic. It's Hellenistic is what it was, a Hellenistic piece. Michelangelo saw that, and it is going to inform all of his human figures, because that's what he's really known for. He is 100% above all else a sculptor. That's all he really wanted to do. And he's a sculptor of the male form. That's his forte. He's did some female figures. He was terrible at female figures. His female figures in the Sistine Chapel are not good. We'll get there when we see them. He doesn't do female figures. He does male figures. If they're supposed to be female, he puts a couple breasts on it, but it's still a male figure. There's no question about it. You can't mistake that for a woman. That's just what he does. That's the ideal. Now, here's our Donatello, our soft, young boy, as opposed to now our adult. He's not old or anything, but he's clearly not a young boy anymore. He's muscular, he's strong. The stances are surprisingly similar, or I shouldn't say surprising, because they're contrapposto. They're that Greek stance, again, with the weight on one leg and the other one relaxed. Now, I love these details. You got to imagine now that head is like this big. It's really massive. It's hard to see them. That is the one thing we lose when we teach like this, is scale, and scale matters. Scale affects how you interpret a work of art. So all I can do is try and get you to think of it as a certain size. Deeply carved, you know, the hair is deeply carved. The eyes, look at the brows. There's a good example of the power of eyebrows, as he's just caught the eye of Goliath off to the side. I love those eyebrows, but I also love that hand. This is someone who's looking at the world. Renaissance artists are looking at the human body, and they are attending dissections at, is that light flickering, or am I having a stroke? Okay. They are attending dissections at medical schools. So they want to know what's under there. They understand the bones, the muscles, the veins. And you know he knows that when you look at this. He sees this, he knows this. I love that hand, because in that hand is the stone that will kill Goliath. That's a poignant hand, and it's an oversized hand. Look at that hand. That hand is huge. And that arm is long. Of course, he is at a bit of an angle, so it would seem longer, but the hand is way oversized because he wants you to, draw your attention to that.
Does he
Very,
put the stone in the other hand? I mean, you said this hand that's down at his side. has
Right.
the
That's the
stone.
stone.
right. And
But
the sling is over his shoulder.
So does he put it over here?
Well, he takes the sling, he puts it in and he shoots it.
Okay, I was gonna have him be left-handed.
I'm sorry, I don't know if he's left. He's got one thing in each hand. Maybe he was.
No, I don't think so.
I haven't a clue.
No.
I don't think, if the Bible doesn't tell us, then I don't think anybody's got a clue. But, okay, we'll make him left-handed for you. Okay, now I need to actually open a different. Actually, I'm gonna do this so that I can see things in the correct size as they're meant to be. And I'm gonna do this. And I'm gonna do this. Stay with me. That back in. And I'm going to do that. Well, I'm going to try to do that. There we go. Going back to the Sistine Chapel. Now we're going to come back at a later date. It is now much later. It's the beginning of the 16th century. Michelangelo gets the commission to paint the ceiling. He is also going to come back another 25 years later and paint the back wall, but that's also something for later because they're different styles. Now, he didn't want to do this. I don't know if any of you heard, there are many, many stories out there about Michelangelo and how he did not want to paint this. He wasn't really a painter. He had done a few paintings, but he wasn't known as a painter. But Julius the First, the Pope, wanted him to do it. One of the, this succession of these powerful popes, one of the things they were doing was having built these massive tombs for themselves. I mean, really huge, covered with sculpture and everything else. And every sculptor wanted the commission to do the sculpture for the tomb of the Pope. I mean, this was like the best commission you could get. And Michelangelo wanted it. Well, Julius said, you're not going to get it unless you paint this chapel. I think one of the greatest mysteries of all time is how he knew he was going to be able to do that, because it wasn't like he was well known as a painter, but somehow Julius decided that's what he wanted. And Michelangelo said no, and he went back to Florence, and Julius actually sent a Swiss guard up to Florence to get him and marched him back to Rome. And so it was like 6 years of hell, because the two men hated each other, first of all. Julius was in there like every few days, are you done yet? Are you done yet? And we all know the horror of fresco anyway, how unpleasant it is because of the heat and the and on the ceiling. I can't even imagine. This is like a liquid material, and you're like that. He hated every minute of it. He hated Julius. It's got flaws in it. It's got a number of flaws in it. Here you can see the cleaning. Now, one of the things it went through in the 70s and 80s, it went through a massive cleaning program because it was like stained glass windows. I mean, this is in a building where you've had candles and soot and accumulating for hundreds of years. And it was just really dark and there was no color and it just looked kind of grayish everywhere. And nobody really paid much attention to that because of an erroneous assumption that is to a certain extent still being made in the art world. And that is that sculptors have no sense of color. That's sort of believed. It's been deeply believed for a long time. He's really a sculptor, so they probably are just this dirty gray color because he's a sculptor and he really couldn't have much of a sense of color, which is totally not true. And it was so problematic that as things were cleaned, as things were being cleaned, the story, got out into the art world. It was really quite a scandal in the art world. First of all, it was being done by Italian restorers. The Italians insisted, this is ours, we're going to do this. And of course, Americans and the British and the French, in particular the French, believed that nobody could do it as well as we could. You're gonna ruin this wonderful thing. So these results start coming out, and the immediate conclusion is, your chemicals have done this. You've ruined this. That he wouldn't have painted that way. This had to be because of you're doing it wrong, and you've destroyed it. And it was extremely controversial for several years until they had panels, national organizations sent representatives and studied it, and they kind of just said, no, actually, this is what it looked like. It really looked, and it took a long time for people to accept that he really painted with colors like this. And he did. He was a brilliant colorist. But when you see the before and after, it's shocking. Here is one of his female figures, which is just a guy with it's just a guy. Some of them are even worse. Some of them are even worse. Okay, so we're going to look at one image. First of all, I don't want to talk about all the different levels and things that are here because it's complicated symbolism and stories of the life of Christ, and we've got nudes in here. There are grisaille figures and fake architecture and various civils and others recording what's going on. And so I just want to look at the main scenes are from the Old Testament, and there's a story from stories from Genesis. They're all scenes from Genesis, beginning with the separation of dark and light, ending at the altar with Noah and the ark. So those are the stories. And right here in the middle is the most famous of the stories. There's some trompe-l'oeil work. Trompe-l'oeil simply meaning fool the eye. The trompe-l'oeil is this fake architecture. It's really meant to make you think there are architectural elements there, and it's sort of fake. There are ignudo. These are the ignudo. The ignudo are some of the most interesting, ignudi plural, which just means nude figures, because this is some of his best work. It turns out that sculptors are very, very good at painting the human body if they've been sculpting the human body. He comes to it with a sculptor's eye, and he paints figures the way nobody's ever painted them before. And afterwards, everybody's going to paint him this way. He's influencing people even before he's finished with the ceiling. So here are the 9 scenes. Now, strangely, when he started at one end, apparently hadn't laid it out properly because he had to do sort of adjustments of the size as he went along. So here's the scene we're going to look at, the very famous scene of creation of Adam, now in its restored color, which is really beautiful. Here's before the color, and here's after the color. It's like a totally different piece. Interestingly, so much of this has become a cliche in modern culture, but certainly wasn't a cliche then. It was totally inventive as a design. I can think of so many cases where you see this sort of cliche image here. Now, when we look at this, one thing might strike you right away, and that this design, this composition, bears no relationship to what I just told you Renaissance art looked like. This is not symmetrical. It is not calm. It's not dominated by horizontals. It's dominated by these diagonal lines that shoot across the picture, creating something very dynamic that gives you a sense of movement from right to left. It's sort of God is swooping in from the right. It's very, very different, and that's just him. And that's why he's so influential on the next generation, which is going to take art in this direction into more dynamic scenes, more movement, more energy. It's a poignant moment. It's a moment, the earth is partially formed, unformed. Adam is unformed. He's sort of limp there. And it's just the moment just before the spark is meant to leap across. And I love this image of God. We've seen a couple of images of God. One we saw in Flanders in the Ghent altarpiece, where he was covered in, jewels and gold and the like. One we just saw, Masaccio, where he was just sort of hanging out in the background. This God is in every way an Olympian Zeus. I mean, the source for this, that's what he is. He's very physical. This is the most physical representation of God that exists in art. And it's clearly based on Greco-Roman images of Zeus and Jupiter on his throne. Very physical, very sculptural. It's forms like this. Look at the musculature, the chiaroscuro, the modeling. It's very three-dimensional, very sculptural. And that's what hadn't been done before in painting, but what will be done now. My favorite part, the colors. How can you look at these colors? They're so unusual. Renaissance painting in general doesn't use color very much. It's basically your three primaries. There's some blue, there's some red, there's a little yellow. That's it. They don't get into subtle colors because colors are emotional and they don't want emotion. They want you, it's an intellectual. Renaissance art is something you're supposed to think about. You're supposed to see it and you're supposed to think. The Last Supper is thoughtful. You think about how they're placed and what this suggests. It's not about feeling. That's the next generation. But this is about feeling. This, in every way, you have to call it high Renaissance, but in every way, it's reflecting something different. Look at those subtle colors. Look at the blue hair. Don't you love that beard, that hair? It's wonderful. And this teal, this sort of beautiful greenish teal. Yeah.
Were they using more subtle colors before this time?
No, they weren't using subtle colors. There's nothing subtle about all the.
I don't mean this. I mean, in the history of the evolution of the eye relating to color.
There's not a lot of color in medieval art.
Right.
The icons are pretty straightforward. We don't know a lot about what paintings there were in Greece, because if they did paintings, we don't have them. The first real paintings we get are Roman wall paintings, and they're not particularly subtle in color. So I would say, yeah, that this is some of the earliest.
Doesn't that have something to do with the fact that earlier was tempera and this is oil?
This is not oil.
Oh,
This is a fresco.
Oh.
So you're working with pure pigment when you could mix in any way you want to. There's nothing that stops you. You're right. You couldn't. It would be hard to do that in tempera. But fresco, do whatever the heck you want. These other figures, it's questioned. Some people still think this is the Virgin Mary and this is the Christ child. Other people say that is the dumbest thing they've ever heard. That's obviously Eve that he's bringing to Adam. She's naked, for God's sake. You don't show the Virgin Mary, nude. It just, so to me, that's clearly Eve. And then this is just foreshadowing later. Because Christ is actually all referred to as the new Adam, because we've also seen other works of art that link to Christ and Adam. So he's there, with his very bent hand on Christ as he's bringing Adam. And the rest of these are just various little, I don't know what's, little Pudi figures. We'll talk about Pudi later. Yeah, here's a detail where you could see them a little better in the beard. Notice how some of these are like really just blurred, so that they look further away to create that illusion as you're looking up.
Did he have God dressed?
Did he have what?
Did he dress God, or was that done later?
No, the ceiling wasn't overpainted. He dressed God. It's the back wall that gets overpainted later, the nudes.
Well, sometimes they covered up.
Yeah, definitely. And they on the back wall, they do a lot of later overpainting of his figures. We'll talk about that when we get to the back wall, because it's about 25 years later. But the ceiling, he didn't have anything that was seen as problematic. Nude Adam, that's okay. the other nudes were heroic and symbolic. Here's our little lightning, but yeah, look at the body that molded. It's like he's just been molded out of clay. And back to the scene. Here's our diagonals, movement across. This is a very good example of how powerful diagonal lines are as opposed to horizontals and verticals. Yeah, let's go on. I'm behind. The more I can get going, the pick up, the better. Our third and last of the high Renaissance masters I'm going to talk about is Raphael. The early Renaissance is a whole century long, and it was several generations of artists. The high Renaissance is one group of 3 or 4 people, and it's very short. By 1525, it's over. It's basically Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, and there's an architect, Bramante, but we're not going to look at his pieces. And that's it. There's no second generation of high Renaissance artists. It's over in 25 years. So the 3 of them are really important. The most important of all of them at the time was Raphael. And Raphael is so overlooked today. I just hate it that everybody heralds Leonardo and Michelangelo. And poor Raphael doesn't get any respect, as Rodney Dangerfield would say. But at the time, he was by far the most famous. And there are reasons for that. I think we've talked before a little bit about the idea of a successful artist versus a good artist. They're not the same thing. You can be a great artist, but not be a success if you don't have the other things that it takes to interact with the right people, be a good business person, know how to, and both Leonardo and Michelangelo were difficult people, particularly Michelangelo. They were hard to work with. They didn't get along, whatever. They had to be pretty darn good to be as successful as they were. Raphael, on the other hand, was a brilliant courtier. He moved in the right circles. He got along with everybody. He was very successful very early. He was also not so much an innovator as he was a synthesizer. He could take, here's what Leonardo did this and Michelangelo did that. And he could take these ideas and he could weave them together into something that's uniquely his style. And then, be in the right place at the right time and know the right people and be very successful. He was very successful. And he was a brilliant mind. He has certain things he was known for. One of them was his images of the Virgin and Child. He really constructs this new way of depicting what is a long known motif of the Virgin and Child. This is a small copper Madonna, as opposed to the large Cowper Madonna. The names are, they come from, at one time it was owned by somebody named Cowper, and they owned 2, and one was big and one was small. I mean, generally, artists didn't title these works of art. These don't come from the artist. They're just names that for one reason or another get attached to a work of art over time, generally because it's listed on an inventory somewhere. If you're doing an inventory, you gotta say something that identifies the painting. And so, well, this is the one that used to be owned by Cowpers, and it's a small one. So we're calling, and then the name just sticks forever, and we lose touch with why it's called that. Titles are important, but they don't begin till a bit later, quite a bit later. Oil on wood still no canvas. That's not happening yet. But it's an answer to that call for intimacy in art that the church had been sort of throwing out there for 100 years. It's, in fact, if you didn't know who this was, if you weren't familiar with this as a Christian motif, it could just be any woman and child. In fact, it's emphasizing that they are mother and child. It's not emphasizing Queen of Heaven or anything that suggests anything particularly spiritual. This is an Italian landscape. It could be any sort of Italian town in the background. It's subtle. It's very quiet. I mean, to me, everything Raphael does is the perfect example of high Renaissance art. Michelangelo in no way is a perfect example of Renaissance art. He is an exception in everything he did. He's great for that, but if you told me I had to teach the Renaissance and I could only show the work of one artist, I wouldn't do Leonardo and I wouldn't do Michelangelo. I would do Raphael, because that's where I can give you everything that would explain this broad moment in time, because he's not that sort of individualized. So very soft, very quiet, very intimate, particularly things like the way that the child's hand is touching her, the way she's holding him here, the way his foot is on her hand. These are choices he has made to give you these intimate moments, to make you think of them as mother and child more so than anything else. There's no halos. He's not blessing anyone that would take you out of that realm, like intentionally putting it in the physical world and intentionally making you think of that story in a different way. This is a really beautiful painting. Look what good shape this is in here. What's interesting about the crocolore is it reflects the brush strokes of the artist. He's still painting in a linear style. We'll talk more about that when they stop painting in a linear style. But what I mean is he's still using fairly small brushes, and he's laying down the strokes like right next to one another. So there are no brush strokes visible. When you look at this, you don't see brush strokes. But with age, as it ages, the cracks reveal the direction of the brush strokes to us. So we can see that he was using contour lines. And contour lines are lines that follow the shape of a form. I mean, you don't have to paint that way. He could have made every line vertical and gotten the same painting, but he's using contour lines. He's shaping, he's following the shape of the surface. And you see that here, how it follows around the curve and reflects. So it wasn't meant to, but it does give us information in the crocolore. I want to spend a little more time on this because, so let's start next time with this portrait, because Raphael is the great portraitist of the Renaissance. Brilliant. You're going to find I'm going to look at more portraits because I love portraits, and I'll tell you why I love them when we look at this, because I think this is one of the most beautiful paintings ever made. Certainly to me, the best, greatest portrait ever made, and I'll tell you why I think that next week. You said you were going to be asking all kinds of questions, and you didn't ask hardly anything.
I have a question.
Yes.
These three, Raphael, Da Vinci,
Yeah.
and
Yep.
Leonardo, and Michelangelo, did they interact? Were they?
Yeah. They knew each other. That's a really good question. They did. They knew each other, they overlapped, but there's enough difference that Leonardo was a very, very old man. Raphael was a very young man about the same time. So, and Michelangelo was there in the middle. So while they're working at the same time, they're almost different generations in a sense. So they weren't close. And of course, Michelangelo didn't get along with anybody. So that's easy. Leonardo didn't get along with many, but we're gonna look next time at a fresco that Raphael painted in the Vatican, not far from the Sistine Chapel. And he would stop in every day and look at what Michelangelo was doing. So he was watching the Sistine Chapel ceiling being painted and going in there and, applying what he had just learned to the fresco he was painting. So yeah, there's an interaction in that way. Raphael is learning and borrowing from both of them. That's basically their interaction. Any other questions anybody have? Well, I want to thank everybody.
Thank you.
We're